Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast is brought to you by Compassion International. $38 a month releases a child from poverty. Check out the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. Every child deserves to have a chance at life. And Compassion International has allowed that chance to happen. And through you and through me and everyone who is a sponsor of a child with Compassion International, we can help make that happen. Food, education, medical care, vocational training, all done in the name of Jesus. $38 a month. What a deal. What an opportunity to make a difference and release a child from poverty. Check out the website again, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Pray about it and consider sponsoring a child in Jesus' name. Today's guest on the podcast is Chris Singleton. Now, Chris has the title of former pro baseball player. He was selected in the 19th round of the 2017 MLB Amateur Draft by the Chicago Cubs, and he played his college ball at Charleston Southern. Last year in single A ball at South Bend with the Cubs minor league affiliate, he played in 107 games, hit 4 homers, and had 26 doubles. And then just before the 2019 season began, he was released. And through that release, Chris decided that he was going to retire at the age of 22 from professional baseball. Now, Chris has a new job. He's currently the director of community outreach for the Charleston RiverDogs, which is the Class A affiliate for the New York Yankees in Charleston, South Carolina. But this name, Chris Singleton, might ring a bell to many of you for another reason. You see, it was Chris's mom, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and 8 others who were killed in the June 2015 mass shooting at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. Horrific event. Many of us remember that. But many of us might also remember Chris Singleton, just the day after that, when he was still playing baseball in college, standing up there in front of the media, and his teammates were with him and his coaches, and with such poise and such class and character, stood up there and answered questions with a peace that passes my understanding, that's for sure, and probably surpassed his as well, in the way that he responded with love, in the way that he wanted people not to riot, but to come together, in the way that he chose to forgive the man who killed his mom and 8 other people because of the color of their skin. Chris Singleton is our guest here on the podcast, and we dive through that journey of not only baseball, but also of grieving the loss of his mother and moving on from that horrific shooting, mass shooting in Charleston. Let's take a listen to Chris Singleton here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you, Chris. And let's start with now, I guess, because there is a lot to unpack, I think, in your story and only a short amount of time to do that in. But it's interesting to me, you were selected in 2017 by the Cubs, released this year, and then you announced your retirement from pro baseball, and you're only 22. Tell us about what went through your mind and the behind everything that led to that decision.
Yeah, I think the first thing that went through my mind was my family. And it's tough to live on a minor league salary for one.
Yes, it is.
But I've got a 1.5-year-old son. I'm married, and I got a 16-year-old little brother that lives with us as well. And so I guess financially, being able to retire at a young age, you think that, oh, you should probably keep playing. But, you know, I definitely needed to support my family and put some food on the table, if I must say. So that was one of the reasons why. The other reasons why is because, this whole time being a baseball player, I never really labeled myself as only that. I used the game of baseball to help me build my platform and share my story. And I try to teach that to people, because so many athletes just categorize themselves as only an athlete. And then when they're done playing, they have a huge identity crisis. They don't know who they are. But that wasn't the case with me. I knew who I was on and off the field.
Tell me about your faith and how that played a role in the decision that you made.
Yeah, I knew. I've known for a while what I've been called to do on this earth, and baseball was a part of that, of course. But also, I think baseball was just kind of the vehicle to get me to the bigger platform that I needed. But after going through what I've gone through in my life, I realized a little while ago that God put me through these things to teach others to get how to get through them. And God put me on this earth to really share my message of love and racial reconciliation. So I guess that played a big part in me parting ways with baseball.
You mentioned I guess we'll say less than glamorous life of a minor leaguer. We've had many minor league players on this podcast, and even major league players who were once minor league players that talked about the grind and the struggle that it is in the minor leagues. And I know last year, I have to imagine, you mentioned, having a young child, a baby basically, and being married and in 2018 playing A-ball in South Bend. What was that life like for you? I know it was 2 seasons that you played in the minors, but just give people a glimpse of the not so glamorous life of minor league baseball.
Yeah. So as soon as I got drafted, all my friends and buddies, they automatically thought I was a millionaire, which is not the case at all.
Right.
I was blessed enough to get a $100,000 signing bonus, but both of my parents are deceased. So
yeah.
I had a little bit of money from them passing away, and I put the other money that I got from playing into a place for us to live. So that's where my money went.
Yeah.
And so people see that signing bonus and they automatically think, oh, you should drive this car, you should be able to do this and be able to do that. But no, when you got a family, you got to make sure that everybody's taken care of. But the 2 years I was playing, I actually had a great time playing, man. I can't really complain too much other than I wasn't really putting food on the table. I had fun meeting a ton of people, traveling places that I probably wouldn't have gone to had it not been for baseball. But it's definitely a grind. I think I was making like maybe $900 after tax a month, which is nothing really to support a family with.
Yeah.
And especially guys that have to pay for rent. So they're paying probably $450 a month for rent. So I guess at the end of the day, they're netting probably $450 playing per month. And that's only in season. Not in season, you don't get paid. So you can see how financially it could be a grind and it could be a struggle.
Yeah. What was it like the living in terms of living where you lived and the way that you lived? I know a lot of players have told me, hey, 7, 8 guys will get in a tiny apartment and just sleep on air mattresses and eat peanut butter and jelly just to make ends meet. What were your sort of accommodations like? Were you staying with a host family? Did they have hotels for you?
Yeah, my first year playing in short season, I stayed at a hotel. And so they automatically took that money out of my check and paid the percentage of the hotel. And I guess they covered the other percentage. So that was good that first year. And my second year was actually a great setup for me. I actually got to stay in a retirement community in South Bend, Indiana. So basically they try to get a couple guys that they think are, I guess, high character guys to live with the older folks that are going to show love to them and hang out with them. And I did that, of course, because I love hearing about people's stories. I love hearing about their experiences. And I want them to hear about me and my message that I'm trying to spread. And it was free. So when I heard it was free, I couldn't turn it down for sure. So I lived in a retirement home. I think the average age was like 74 years old. So my son was a baby. He only got to come up twice that year. So that was definitely tough, and that was a struggle. But I guess being able to live with a host family or in a retirement home like I did, it kind of saved us a little bit of money from the little bit of money that we got.
What did you learn, though? I mean, being around, 74, if you want to say the average person, there's a lot of wisdom to be had there, I guess. What was some of the lessons that you learned just being around some of those older people?
Yeah, honestly, I think the biggest lesson that I learned is from people that were married for so long. They said sometimes they had to put their pride to the side because I told them how I was getting married, and everybody wanted to give me marriage advice. So that's one thing that I learned. Sometimes we got to put our pride to the side and listen more than we speak when it comes to our spouses. And they also told me that one of the key things to having such a long marriage is keeping God in your relationship as well. And that's one thing that me and my wife have tried to do thus far in the little bit of time that we've been married. We've made sure that God's number one in our lives, and then our relationship comes next.
That's really good. Chris Singleton is our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Your story is well known in many ways because of a speech you made at Charleston Southern University immediately after the death of your mother. Let's go back just a little bit before we talk about that incident and hear about your journey as a kid growing up in South Carolina. You mentioned both your parents were deceased now. I don't think a lot of people know maybe the story of your father, but what was life like growing up as a kid in South Carolina?
I say when I got to South Carolina, my parents remarried. So I moved from Atlanta, Georgia, to South Carolina in middle school.
Gotcha.
And when I moved to Charleston, I've always been a big baseball guy. I played baseball since I was 4 years old. And when I was growing up in Atlanta, it was an all-black team. There's one Latin guy, and that was the only guy that wasn't black. So being white was a minority on the team in Atlanta. I moved to Charleston, and I'm the only black guy on the team. So it was definitely a huge culture shift for me as far as playing with people that look like me in the sport that I played forever. So that was different. But growing up, my mom was huge in her faith. She was a big-time believer. But one thing that I always stress every time I talk about my mom is that she was a kind of Christian that wouldn't throw religion at you like a rock or like a brick. She wouldn't just throw it at you. She would kind of place it on you like a blanket. You know, she was so good with people that people would ask her, do you believe in this or that? And then she would explain it. And it made so much sense because she the way she went about her everyday life, you could see how she was a believer.
What about your dad? I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but just curious about having your father. You said your parents remarried. Was your father in your life growing up?
Yeah, so my dad was in my life growing up. Whenever I talk about my dad, I talk about how much he loved his kids, but my dad was an alcoholic ever since I was born.
Yeah. And
so it went from him being a functioning alcoholic, drinking at night, waking up in the morning, then going to work, until him being a non-functioning alcoholic when I was in about the third grade. That's when my parents got divorced. My dad had been drinking a lot and wasn't waking up for work. Eventually got fired. Had got a couple DUIs. And then after that, my parents split, and my dad was sober for a whole year. And that's when they got remarried. And then eventually my dad continued to start drinking again. And so, yeah, my dad, I always say my dad loved us very much, but he couldn't put the bottle down. So that's one thing I always talk about in my life is my dad was an alcoholic. My dad's dad was an alcoholic. So I'm making it number one thing in my life to make sure I don't follow that trend and don't become an alcoholic like my father and my grandfather were. But my dad was definitely in my life. He just couldn't put the bottle down.
Yeah, we have a lot of similarities there. My father, an alcoholic as well. And I just wonder, I was the oldest of three, too. So we're very similar in that realm. And I was kind of forced to grow up, especially being the oldest in a single parent household, with my mom working all the time. You've had to do that a lot, especially you just mentioned having your 16-year-old brother live with you when your mom was unfortunately killed. You've had to do a lot of growing up, especially without a male sort of figure, your dad in your life, as you've gotten older. What's some of those lessons that maybe you look back at now and you think, man, I had to grow up quickly, and that being so young and having to sort of take on responsibility at such a young age, what are some of the lessons that you were taught through that? And I know we'll talk about the situation and the shooting in 4 years ago in a second, but just some of the lessons that you've had to learn growing up so fast.
One thing I've learned, I guess, is how expensive life is. Being 19 and having no parents to say, hey, can you pay my car insurance? Or hey, can you pay for my health insurance? That kind of thing, I guess.
That's true.
Was definitely a shell shock to see how expensive life really is. As a teenager, we always think, I could probably live on my own and I'll be all right. And so you actually are forced to do it. And you say, hey, I better start saving some money and stop eating out so much or things like that. So that was definitely different for me to have to learn really quickly. But I think it kind of played to an advantage now because I've had to grow up so much quicker than others that now they're going through that phase themselves, and I've already been through it a while ago. So I think it was definitely tough doing it, but now I'm actually appreciative of the things that I've learned because of it.
We mentioned that day in the intro, June 17th, 2015, a day you probably think about every day, I would imagine, as hard as that day is now. And 4 years later, I don't know if it's even easier or harder to reflect and talk to it about what happened. Maybe that's the question. Is it easier now to talk about, or is it still hard to talk about? And I know you talk all the time because you're traveling across the country, and this day, this horrific day comes up, I'm sure, every time that you speak. But is it harder to talk about or easier to talk about now that it's been 4 years?
That's a really good question. I think to a certain extent, it has gotten a little bit easier to talk about it. Just because I speak about it so much, and I want people to know the backstory before I tell them my mission. But I definitely have some times where there's a lump in my throat when I'm talking about that day. And so I don't think it'll ever be easy to speak about it, but it has gotten a little bit easier as time has gone on.
Can you share just a little bit? It was June of 2015, and it was a mass shooting, obviously, at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston that took the life of your mom and 8 others. For those that are listening and may not understand exactly what we're talking about, your mom was an assistant pastor, Sharonda. Can you tell us a little bit about her role in the church? This is a faith and sports podcast, and I think we have a lot of people who are in church. And just, I think from a background perspective before that day, what was her role as an assistant pastor? And it sounds like somebody who was in the church quite a bit.
Yeah, so she was our assistant pastor. She also was over our youth here at the church. So she was our youth minister leader, and I would help out with her doing that. But she always had a soft spot for the youth. So even when she was working as a speech pathologist, she was a track coach in high school because she ran in college herself. So she always had a kind of a soft spot for making sure she gave back to people, to kids. So she was so good at, like I said, teaching religion, teaching Christianity to young people, because she didn't throw it at you. And so she was so good with the youth and getting them to believe and buy into what we all should believe, in my eyes. So I think her being sent down here to earth was for the youth. I think that's something she did really, really well.
As you look back now, remembering that night and trying to find out, as you find out what had happened, the grieving process. I think a lot of people, especially who haven't gone through a tragedy like that, like myself, I've had people close to me pass, but not in this way, obviously. How would you tell them, how would you share with them in the process of grieving as you're going through something as difficult as this is, now that you look back and being able to, because I remember that speech that you gave at Charleston Southern was so real and so quick after everything had happened, and you seemed so poised. And I thought, man, how is he so poised when this horrific thing just happened? Talk about the grief and the processing of that over those few days.
So when I explained me giving that speech the next day, I can't help but say it wasn't just me. I'm not a person that's going to sit here and tell you, I'm the one that stopped our city from rioting. I'm the one that did this or did that, because it wasn't just me. I know for a fact that God was using me in that time. If you would have asked me before that, would I react that way when my mom was killed because of the color of her skin, I would have thought there's no way in a million years I would react that way. That's how I know it wasn't just me that day when I forgave the man for killing my mom. That's how I know it wasn't just me when I said the words, love is always stronger than hate. So if we just love the way my mom would, hate won't be anywhere close to it. I know it wasn't just me that day. So when I talk about the grieving process afterwards, I always talk about people that are friends and family of the person that's had a tragedy in their life. Because I always get people asking me, Chris, you've gone through this, you've gone through that. What would you say to somebody that's a friend of a person that lost a parent? What would you say to somebody that's a friend of a husband that lost a wife? Yeah. And the first thing I always say is, everybody says, is there anything I can do for you? And I think that's a great thing to say. But at the same time, if you know their favorite restaurant, why don't you just bring them a Chick-fil-A sandwich or whatever it may be, and talk about, a cool show on Netflix to do, because there's so many thoughts going through that person's mind about what could they have done different. What would they say to their parent or spouse, or if they were still here? And all those things are good to go through in your head. But there's also some times where you just need to have a regular, everyday lunch, sit down with your friend and watch a funny movie, or to get your mind off of things. So I always tell people, if they have a favorite pizza spot, go to that pizza spot with them and talk about something completely different than the tragedy that just happened, because that's always on their mind 24/7. But sitting down, talking to them about something different is going to be huge in their grieving process.
Was that something you were able to experience with friends, if they were able to come in alongside of you and just say, hey, let's go get a pizza and talk about girls or talk about Netflix or talk about sports? Were you able to do that at all?
Yeah, so I'd have my buddies come over, and we just play video games or something with my little brother.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't talk about anything that was going on. We would just talk about, hey, this is funny that this happened on a video game, or that happened on a video game. And so it wasn't like we were just putting away our thoughts for later. That wasn't what it was. It was just getting our mind off of things in the moment, which was so good for the healing process. Also, with me personally, I always talk about baseball was sent to me for that reason, because baseball was my getaway when I was grieving. I could literally go on the field and I would stop thinking about, this about my mom, or I would stop thinking about my dad and this. There would be times I would go in the cage and I would hit for hours upon hours on the tee, listening to music just by myself. So if you play a sport, I think that's something huge in your grieving process, because it's kind of your getaway, your safe haven when you have all those thoughts going through your mind.
This may seem like a weird question, but just being the oldest of three myself, and you have two younger siblings, did when your mom was killed and then your dad not being around, did it almost help that you had to kind of go into big brother mode? Maybe you didn't go into big brother mode, but I'm thinking you have two younger siblings here that you kind of have to be the father figure to, the older brother to, in this process. So it allowed you to take your mind off of, having to figure things out and to go into sort of caring mode for your brother and sister.
Yeah, I think that was good, but at the same time, there were some times where I was putting up a fake facade of being always okay, in turn, my brother and sister would pretend to do the same, and I did that for a while until I actually broke down in front of my brother, and I think that was the first time he actually seen me cry after my mom was killed.
Yeah,
and by him seeing me do that, he let all his feelings out, and I think that was such a big thing for me to do, to be transparent and stop just pretending that it didn't matter to me, or stop pretending that it didn't hurt me, and showing him that, hey, it's okay for me to let these feelings out. Showed him that he could cry and he wouldn't be looked at as weak for doing that. And so I think if we kind of put down that fake wall of being Superman all the time, and we show our feelings just for a little while if we need to, it can be in private, it can be in public. But when we do that, it allows our family members to grieve the way they need to.
In Romans, it says, in the book of Romans, it says that all things work together for the good of those who are called and love God and called according to his purpose. Have you been able to see good come out of this? I know there's a lot of bad and a lot of tragedy here, but have you seen that kind of Bible verse that Paul writes about in Romans kind of lived through your life?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's kind of a perspective you got to have when you're facing any type of tragedy, any type of adversity in your life. And if you can say that there's going to be something that's going to come good from this, and it's kind of going to give you a little bit of sense of calmness about what happened. And me personally, just sharing and telling my story has been so good, not only for people that are hearing it and saying, Chris, you don't even know what you just said to me today. I was feeling this way about that. It's good for me, and it was therapeutic for me. And I'll give you one quick story about forgiveness and about me talking about it. So I was speaking at this church, and it was one of the first, I guess, speaking engagements I actually did. And it was a couple years ago, probably about 3 years ago, and I was talking about forgiveness, and a guy came up to me and he said, Chris, I think God sent you today to tell me that message. And I was speaking to youth, but this guy's a little bit older. He was probably in his early 20s, mid-20s. And he said, well, Chris, I was adopted when I was really, really young. My birth mother gave me away, and I've always had a kind of a hatred towards her because of that, because I felt like I would never do that to my kid. I don't understand how she could do it to me. And he says, just recently, she reached out to me and said, Chris, I want to hang out with you. I want to meet you. I want to see you. And he said he was fighting it so much because he said, there's no way I could ever forgive this lady for doing what she did to me. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to make that make that choice for you to forgive her, but all I'm going to do is ask you to have lunch with her. And he did that, and he had lunch with her, and he said afterwards they have a great relationship now. He never would have thought they would, but he said that it all came because he heard me speak that one day. And when I heard that story, I realized that, yes, there's going to be some good coming from me telling my story.
Jeez.
And that gives me the inspiration and the kind of the will and the passion to keep going forward and continue to tell my story.
That's awesome. It's really great, Chris. And I can't encourage you more to keep telling that story. I travel around a lot too and talk about forgiveness, and I can share my story when we're done here, off the air, and tell you why I do that. But I've learned so much in forgiving, in living out a life of forgiveness in my life over the past, say, 5 years. What have you learned about forgiveness? What's the big, I'll just say it like this. Why is forgiveness so important in our lives?
I think the number one reason why people don't forgive, I think there's a couple reasons, but I think a big reason is because they feel like they weren't in the wrong, and it would be weak for them to forgive. They think that it's always about the other person. Yeah. When in turn, I think forgiveness is so huge for the person that's doing the forgiving. I think when we forgive, that constant, anxiety about revenge or whatever it may be, that's removed. It's already out of your mind. And it's done. Like, even when I speak about my mom and my mother's killer, I never think initially about the man that murdered my mom. I always think about the good that's going to come from me telling this story. I think maybe by me forgiving him, that in the future, me speaking this story can stop somebody from doing what he did to my mom. So it's never like I'm forgiving for that person. Sometimes you forgive for your inner peace.
Yeah. I always tell people forgiveness sets a prisoner free, and we discover the prisoner is the person who isn't forgiving. It's us, right? And that's so powerful, and it's changed my outlook on forgiveness as well. A couple more questions here with Chris Singleton on the podcast. And again, Chris, really appreciate your time here. There's a documentary that's coming out that Steph Curry, the NBA star, and Viola Davis have produced called Emanuel. It's releasing in June on the 4-year anniversary of the shooting. Can you share a little bit about that documentary, what you know about it? The trailer is powerful. Steph has shared it. I know you've shared it as well on your social media pages. Share a little bit about that, about the documentary, what you know about it, maybe what it's about, what we can expect.
Yeah, man. I've already seen the documentary. I've already seen it. It is phenomenal. I think it's fit for all ages. I don't think you should try to shield your kids from it or whatever your thoughts may be about it.
It's good.
I think that it's definitely a faith-based thing. I think you're definitely going to see the Lord working in it. One of the producers, Brian Ivy, he's a big-time believer. And from the moment I said I would be on it, he said, Chris, we're going to bring people to Jesus with this thing. And I think people are going to come to know the Lord because of it. And so it's not just about the bad that happened that night. I think it's about the history behind it, and ways we can move forward. And I think it also talks about the power of forgiveness, like we both always talk about.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great film, not only for the adults but for youth to hear as well. And I just want to thank Steph and Viola again, because without their platform, not as many people would know about it. Not as many people would go to watch it. But they've been great. They've been awesome people, and I can't wait for people to see it and see how the Lord's working in it.
Tell me about now, today. Certainly the racial reconciliation part that you speak about, I think, is an important component here, but also about the church. I hadn't done my research, so I don't know the answer to this, and maybe I'll just ask you, like, is the church still going strong? Did they close down? Is it still, is that church still, available for people to attend on Sunday mornings? Tell us about today and kind of 4 years later and the aftermath.
Yeah, it is. It is still going. Every single Sunday. They also have Bible studies on Wednesday. And I haven't been back to the church myself for a service. I've been back when my father passed away. I've always been on the road, but now that I'm back here in Charleston, I'm actually meeting with the pastor at the end of this week. So it's going to be a great time to sit down and talk with him about some things that are going on, some things that I think we can push the mission of racial reconciliation. But with me, when I talk about it, I always talk about it starts with our youth. And because the next generation is, I feel like can really do some huge healing in the facts that I think before us, or before me, because I'm a young guy, and people, their parents were still in the segregation, or, there were still parts of all those things. And I think all that stuff is washed away with this next generation. So if we instill the right information in them and we teach them the right things, I think that the world's got a lot of hope and a lot of great things going forward. So I always tell people, nobody chooses their skin color. So I shouldn't hate you for yours, and you should never hate me for mine.
Yeah, that's it. Amen, my friend. Amen. Now, real quick, I know I said a couple more, but I didn't ask you about this. You have a new role. You're with the Charleston RiverDogs as a director of community outreach. That's your current role here. Tell us about that job and kind of what it entails. It sounds like it's a pretty sweet gig.
Yeah, it's been great, man. I've been here for about a week now, and basically what I'm doing is I get to do all the community outreach, speak to all the high schools, the middle schools, the elementary schools here in our hometown of Charleston, and be backed by the RiverDogs. I also get to work with the local nonprofits to see how we can build them and their missions and their efforts towards the game of baseball, and also what they're doing with their philanthropic work. Also, lastly, my biggest thing is Holy City Sundays. I'm bringing out churches all around Charleston to the ballpark, and really getting them to love their people, love the people around baseball, and really try to get some of the Lord here in this game. Some things that I'm working with the RiverDogs, and I'm also speaking around this country. Like, if people want to book me, they can easily go to my website, www.thechrisSingleton.com, and I'm still traveling. They're allowing me to do so, so it's so good, man.
No, that's great. thechrisSingleton.com. Check out the website there, and definitely would love to hear you speak sometime, Chris. I'm sure your message is a powerful one, and it's definitely a message that everybody needs to hear. Last question. We ask this to all of our guests here on the podcast. Today, it's now 4 years since the incident, almost 4 years. Where you are, you're still so young, 22, but you're married, you have a child now, growing up so quickly. What is the Lord teaching you right now? What are you learning from Christ in this phase of life that you're in? What is God teaching you?
I think one thing that God's teaching me is really to be more grateful. Sometimes I find myself being such a young, ambitious person that I'm always looking for the next thing, or how can I impact more, or how can I do this or do that? When in actuality, God's blessed me with so many things already. And before I can ask for this or ask for that, I need to be grateful for what he's already given me and what he trusts me with so far. So that's one thing that I'm learning, like literally right here, right now, is to be grateful for each and every opportunity that I'm presented.
He is Chris Singleton. Really great stuff, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. TheChrisSingleton.com is the website. Check it out, and check out the documentary that's coming out in June called Emanuel, produced by Steph Curry, Viola Davis. Going to be really good there. Powerful story there, and certainly your life has been a powerful story, Chris. Continue success, continue sharing that word and encouraging people, and I look forward to hopefully shaking your hand in person. We're going to be out in Charleston next week, so look forward to seeing you there, and thanks again for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, man.
And many thanks to Chris Singleton for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. His Twitter bio says it perfectly. He's a servant of God, an inspirational keynote speaker. He was featured on E60, USA Today, The Today Show, Sports Illustrated, a former pro ball player, and the website, thechrisSingleton.com. You can check out that website to learn more about Chris. Maybe you want to have him come speak and share his powerful story with your audience. thechrisSingleton.com again is the website. Check it out and give him a follow on Twitter. C_Singleton_2. C_Singleton_2. It's a powerful story. There's not a whole lot to really expand on here other than it was a horrific event. Chris is taking that event and trying to pass on that message of love and of hope, and love being stronger than anger, love being stronger than hate. And I love that he's trying to bring peace and reconciliation, racial reconciliation within all of this world. And we so need that. We so do. And just grateful for Chris to join us here on the podcast. Again, give him a follow on Twitter and check out his website, thechrisSingleton.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. We're also thankful to our sponsors, Compassion International, $38 a month. It gets you a chance to sponsor a child in Jesus' name and release them from poverty, food education, medical care, vocational training, all done in Jesus' name. Over 2 million children being impacted by the great work being done at Compassion International. They do it through the local church, and it's such a powerful way to reach kids who are in need of hope, who are in need of the basic essentials of life. So make that difference, release a child, and sponsor them through Compassion. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum. Release a child from poverty today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at sports_spectrum. Give us a like on our YouTube page as well, and check out our website, sportspectrum.com. Daily content issued all day long, including a devotional. And you can also subscribe to our quarterly magazine for just $18. What a deal. sportspectrum.com. Check it out and subscribe today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time here on the Sports Spectrum Podcast. We love you guys. We hope you have a great rest of your day. This is Sports Spectrum.